Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the two ladies went to get ready, and at 6:30, Elizabeth was called to dinner. She faced a barrage of polite inquiries, including Mr. Bingley's more sincere concern, but she couldn't provide a very positive update. Jane's condition hadn't improved at all. Upon hearing this news, the sisters expressed their sympathy multiple times, emphasizing how unfortunate it was to have a bad cold and how much they detested being ill themselves. After a brief display of concern, they promptly moved on and seemed indifferent to Jane's plight. Their lack of interest in Jane, when she wasn't in their immediate presence, rekindled Elizabeth's original dislike of them. The only member of the party who she found agreeable was their brother. His genuine worry for Jane was evident, and his attention towards Elizabeth was pleasant. It made her feel less like an intruder compared to the others who seemed to disregard her. She received little notice from anyone else but him. Miss Bingley was absorbed in conversation with Mr. Darcy, and her sister was not much different. As for Mr. Hurst, who sat next to Elizabeth, he was an indolent man who lived for eating, drinking, and playing cards. When he noticed Elizabeth's preference for a plain dish over a more elaborate one, he had nothing to say to her. After dinner, Elizabeth returned to Jane, while Miss Bingley wasted no time in criticizing her once she left the room. They described her manners as terrible, a combination of pride and impertinence. They criticized her lack of conversation, style, taste, and beauty. Mrs. Hurst shared the same view, and they went on to add that the only thing she had going for her was being a good walker. They mocked her appearance that morning, saying she looked almost wild with her messy hair and disheveled petticoat. Elizabeth defended her sister, but the others continued to ridicule Jane's actions. Bingley, however, praised Jane's affection for her sister, which Elizabeth appreciated. Miss Bingley then made fun of Elizabeth for not playing cards, to which Elizabeth responded that she would rather read a book. Mr. Hurst expressed his surprise that Elizabeth preferred reading to playing cards, and Miss Bingley commented on Elizabeth's disdain for card games, noting that she was an avid reader. Elizabeth clarified that while she enjoyed reading, she also found pleasure in many other things. As they discussed the accomplishments of young ladies, Bingley expressed amazement at how accomplished they all were. Miss Bingley and her sisters, on the other hand, agreed that young ladies were expected to be highly accomplished. Darcy, however, pointed out the truth in Bingley's statement, explaining that many women were considered accomplished for skills like netting purses and covering screens, without possessing any substantial knowledge. Darcy emphasized the importance of improving the mind through extensive reading. Elizabeth challenged the idea that all accomplished women needed to excel in so many areas. Darcy acknowledged that his estimation of accomplished women was limited to only a few in his acquaintance. The conversation turned to Miss Darcy's growth since spring, and Elizabeth mentioned that she had grown taller. They admired Miss Darcy's talents and accomplishments, and Bingley wondered how young ladies had the patience to acquire so many skills. Miss Bingley expressed disbelief at Elizabeth's implied doubt regarding accomplished women, and Elizabeth remarked that she had never met someone who embodied all those qualities. The discussion about accomplishments came to an end as Mr. Hurst called them to attention, complaining about their inattentiveness. Elizabeth left the room and Miss Bingley commented on her as soon as the door closed, accusing her of trying to gain favor with men by undervaluing her own sex. Darcy agreed that using such tactics to captivate others was despicable. Elizabeth returned to the room to report that her sister was worse, and Bingley insisted on calling for Mr. Jones, the local apothecary. His sisters, however, believed that only a renowned physician from town would do, and they suggested sending for one. Elizabeth refused the latter idea but was willing to consider calling Mr. Jones in the morning if Jane did not improve. Bingley was visibly uncomfortable, his sisters miserable. To alleviate their distress, they played duets after supper while Bingley directed his housekeeper to ensure Jane and her sister received the best possible care. Chapter 9. Elizabeth spent most of the night in her sister's room. In the morning, she was relieved to be able to send a satisfactory response to Mr. Bingley's inquiries. She received an early message from him through a housemaid, and later, the two elegant ladies who attended his sisters also inquired about Jane's condition. Despite this improvement, Elizabeth requested that a note be sent to Longbourn, asking her mother to visit Jane and form her own opinion about her situation. The note was sent promptly and Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest daughters, arrived at Netherfield soon after breakfast. If Jane had been in any real danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been greatly distressed. However, after seeing her daughter, she realized that Jane's illness wasn't severe. Mrs. Bennet wasn't in a hurry for Jane to recover completely because she feared that Jane's return to health would mean leaving Netherfield. She rejected her daughter's suggestion of being taken back home. The apothecary, who arrived around the same time, also advised against moving Jane. After a brief visit with Jane, the mother and her three daughters joined Miss Bingley in the breakfast parlour. Bingley greeted them with hope that Mrs. Bennet hadn't found Miss Bennet's condition worse than expected. Mrs. Bennet replied, "Indeed I have, sir. She is much too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we mustn't even think of it. We'll have to impose a little longer on your kindness." Bingley exclaimed, moved. "We mustn't even consider it. My sister won't allow her to be moved." Miss Bingley, with cold civility, added, "Rest assured, Miss Bennet will receive every possible attention while she remains with us." Mrs. Bennet profusely thanked her, saying, "I am sure, if it weren't for such good friends, I don't know what would become of her. She is very ill indeed, and suffers a lot, but she endures it with the greatest patience, as she always does. She has the sweetest temper I've ever seen. I often tell my other daughters they can't compare to her. Mr. Bingley, you have a lovely room here, and a charming view from that gravel walk. There's no place in the country that's better than Netherfield. I hope you won't think of leaving here too soon, even though you have a short lease." Bingley replied, "Whatever I do in a hurry, so if I were to decide to leave Netherfield, I'd probably be gone in 5 minutes. But for now, I consider myself quite settled here." Elizabeth commented, "You're starting to understand me, aren't you?" Bingley asked, "Oh yes, I understand you perfectly." Elizabeth smiled and said, "I hope you take that as a compliment." Bingley replied, "I wish I could, but being so easily read through is pitiful." Elizabeth's mother, wanting to remind her of the proprieties, said, "Lizzie, remember where you are and don't behave as wildly as you do at home." Bingley quickly said, "I didn't know before that you were a student of character. It must be an interesting study." Elizabeth responded, "Yes, but complex characters are the most interesting. They have that advantage, Darcy added, in the countryside, there are few subjects for such a study. In a rural neighborhood, you interact with a small, unchanging society. Elizabeth argued, but people themselves change so much that there's always something new to observe in them. Mrs. Bennet, offended by Darcy's mention of a rural neighborhood, exclaimed, I assure you, there's just as much going on in the country as in town. Everyone was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at Mrs. Bennet for a moment, turned away in silence. Mrs. Bennet thought she had won a complete victory over him and continued triumphantly, I can't see that London has any great advantage over the country, except for the shops and public places. The country is much more pleasant, isn't it, Mr. Bingley? Bingley replied, when I'm in the country, I never want to leave it. When I'm in town, it's pretty much the same. Each has its advantages, and I can be equally happy in either. Elizabeth said, you start to understand me, don't you? Bingley asked, oh yes, I understand you perfectly. Elizabeth's mother, concerned about her daughter's behavior, said, Lizzie, remember where you are and don't behave as wildly as you do at home. Bingley quickly added, I didn't know before that you were a student of character. It must be an interesting study. Elizabeth responded, yes, but complex characters are the most interesting. They have that advantage. Darcy said, in the countryside, there are few subjects for such a study. In a rural neighborhood, you interact with a small, unchanging society. Elizabeth argued, but people themselves change so much that there's always something new to observe in them. Mrs. Bennet, offended by Darcy's mention of a rural neighborhood, exclaimed, I assure you, there's just as much going on in the country as in town. Everyone was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at Mrs. Bennet for a moment, turned away in silence. Mrs. Bennet thought she had won a complete victory over him and continued triumphantly, I can't see that London has any great advantage over the country, except for the shops and public places. The country is much more pleasant, isn't it, Mr. Bingley? Bingley replied, when I'm in the country, I never want to leave it. When I'm in town, it's pretty much the same. Each has its advantages, and I can be equally happy in either. Elizabeth asked, don't you think so, Mr. Darcy? Darcy, with a slight smile, replied, I have no preference for one over the other. Each has its merits. Elizabeth then changed the topic, asking if Charlotte Lucas had visited Longbourn since her departure. Mrs. Bennet answered, yes, she came yesterday with her father. Sir William is such a pleasant man, isn't he? So refined and genteel. He always has something to say to everyone. Elizabeth spent most of the night in her sister's room. In the morning, she was relieved to be able to send a satisfactory response to Mr. Bingley's inquiries. She received an early message from him through a housemaid, and later, the two elegant ladies who attended his sisters also inquired about Jane's condition. Despite this improvement, Elizabeth requested that a note be sent to Longbourn, asking her mother to visit Jane and form her own opinion about her situation. The note was sent promptly, and Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest daughters, arrived at Netherfield soon after breakfast. If Jane had been in any real danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been greatly distressed. However, after seeing her daughter, she realized that Jane's illness wasn't severe. Mrs. Bennet wasn't in a hurry for Jane to recover completely because she feared that Jane's return to health would mean leaving Netherfield. She rejected her daughter's suggestion of being taken back home. The apothecary, who arrived around the same time, also advised against moving Jane. After a brief visit with Jane, the mother and her 3 daughters joined Miss Bingley in the breakfast parlour. Bingley greeted them with hope that Mrs. Bennet hadn't found Miss Bennet's condition worse than expected. Mrs. Bennet replied, "Indeed I have, sir. She is much too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we mustn't even think of it. We'll have to impose a little longer on your kindness." Bingley exclaimed, moved. "We mustn't even consider it. My sister won't allow her to be moved." Miss Bingley, with cold civility, added, "Rest assured, Miss Bennet will receive every possible attention while she remains with us." Mrs. Bennet profusely thanked her, saying, "I am sure, if it weren't for such good friends, I don't know what would become of her. She is very ill indeed, and suffers a lot, but she endures it with the greatest patience, as she always does. She has the sweetest temper I've ever seen. I often tell my other daughters they can't compare to her. Mr. Bingley, you have a lovely room here, and a charming view from that gravel walk. There's no place in the country that's better than Netherfield. I hope you won't think of leaving here too soon, even though you have a short lease." Bingley replied, "Whatever I do in a hurry, so if I were to decide to leave Netherfield, I'd probably be gone in 5 minutes. But for now, I consider myself quite settled here." Elizabeth commented, "You're starting to understand me, aren't you?" Bingley asked, "Oh yes, I understand you perfectly." Elizabeth smiled and said, "I hope you take that as a compliment." Bingley replied, "I wish I could, but being so easily read through is pitiful." Elizabeth's mother, wanting to remind her of the proprieties, said, "Lizzie, remember where you are and don't behave as wildly as you do at home." Bingley quickly added, "I didn't know before that you were a student of character. It must be an interesting study." Elizabeth responded, "Yes, but complex characters are the most interesting. They have that advantage." Darcy added, "In the countryside, there are few subjects for such a study. In a rural neighborhood, you interact with a small, unchanging society." Elizabeth argued, "But people themselves change so much that there's always something new to observe in them." Mrs. Bennet, offended by Darcy's mention of a rural neighborhood, exclaimed, "I assure you, there's just as much going on in the country as in town." Everyone was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at Mrs. Bennet for a moment, turned away in silence. Mrs. Bennet thought she had won a complete victory over him and continued triumphantly, "I can't see that London has any great advantage over the country, except for the shops and public places. The country is much more pleasant, isn't it, Mr. Bingley?" Bingley replied, "When I'm in the country, I never want to leave it. When I'm in town, it's pretty much the same. Each has its advantages, and I can be equally happy in either." Elizabeth asked, "Don't you think so, Mr. Darcy?" Darcy, with a slight smile, replied, "I have no preference for one over the other. Each has its merits." Elizabeth then changed the topic, asking if Charlotte Lucas had visited Longbourn since her departure. Mrs. Bennet answered, "Yes, she came yesterday with her father. Sir William is such a pleasant man, isn't he? So refined and genteel. He always has something to say to everyone. Chapter 10. The day passed much like the one before it. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with Jane, who was slowly recovering. In the evening, Elizabeth joined them in the drawing-room. However, there was no loo table in sight. Mr. Darcy was busy writing, and Miss Bingley, seated nearby, watched him as he penned his letter. She frequently interrupted him with messages for his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were engrossed in a game of piquet, and Mrs. Hurst observed their play. Elizabeth picked up some needlework and found amusement in eavesdropping on the conversation between Darcy and Miss Bingley. Miss Bingley continuously praised Darcy, whether it was for his handwriting, the neatness of his lines, or the length of his letter. Darcy accepted her compliments with indifference, which matched her opinion of him. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter!" Miss Bingley exclaimed. Darcy remained silent. "You write remarkably fast," she said. "You are mistaken." "I write rather slowly," he replied. "How many letters you must have to write in a year?" "Business letters too? I would find them odious. Fortunately, they fall to my lot rather than yours. Please tell your sister that I'm eager to see her. I've already delivered that message on your behalf. I'm afraid you don't like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I'm quite skilled at pen mending." "Thank you, but I prefer to mend my own pen." "How do you manage to write so neatly?" Darcy remained silent. "Tell your sister that I'm thrilled to hear about her progress on the harp. And please inform her that I'm absolutely delighted with her beautiful table design. It's far superior to Miss Grantley's. Would you allow me to delay my praise until I write again? I don't have enough space to do it justice right now." "That's of no consequence. I'll see her in January." "But do you always write such long and charming letters to her, Mr. Darcy?" "They are usually long, but whether they are always charming, I cannot say." Elizabeth interjected, "It's a rule for me that a person who can write a long letter easily cannot write poorly." Darcy replied, "That rule doesn't apply to Darcy, Caroline," said her brother. "He doesn't write easily. He uses too many words with 4 syllables. Don't you, Darcy? My writing style is very different from yours." Miss Bingley chimed in, "Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest. My ideas flow so rapidly that I don't have time to express them, so my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents." Elizabeth said, "Your humility, Mr. Bingley, must be disarming." Darcy added, "Humility can often be deceptive. It's often just carelessness of opinion or an indirect form of boasting." Elizabeth quipped, "And which of those two describes my recent modesty?" Darcy answered, "The indirect boasting, for you are truly proud of your writing defects. You believe they result from quick thinking and carelessness in execution, which you find intriguing. The ability to do things quickly is highly valued by its possessor, even without regard to the quality of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you decided to leave Netherfield, you'd be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it as a compliment to yourself. But what is so commendable about being hasty when it leaves important tasks undone and benefits no one, not even yourself? Bingley retorted, "This is too much. You remember all the foolish things said in the morning. And I believed what I said about myself, and I still believe it now. I didn't pretend to be needlessly hasty just to impress the ladies." Elizabeth questioned, "Would Mr. Darcy consider your initial impulsiveness justified by your stubbornness in sticking to it?" Bingley responded, "I can't explain it exactly, but Darcy should speak for himself." Elizabeth said, "You expect me to explain opinions you attribute to me, but which I've never acknowledged. Assuming your representation is correct, Miss Bennet, consider that the friend who requested his return and the postponement of his plan only made the request without providing any arguments in its favor. To easily yield to a friend's persuasion is no merit in your eyes. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the intellect." Elizabeth continued, "Mr. Darcy, it seems you give no consideration to the influence of friendship and affection. Often, one will readily grant a request from a friend without waiting for persuasive arguments. I'm not speaking specifically about Mr. Bingley's case. We should perhaps wait until the circumstance arises before discussing the propriety of his behavior. But generally, in cases between friends, where one is asked by the other to change a resolution of little consequence, would you think ill of a person for complying with the request without waiting for arguments?" Darcy suggested, "Before we proceed further on this subject, should we not determine with more precision the importance of this request and the degree of intimacy between the parties?" Bingley enthusiastically agreed, saying, "Let's hear all the details, including their relative heights and sizes. Miss Bennet, you may not be aware, but that will carry weight in this argument. I assure you that if Darcy weren't such a tall fellow compared to me, I wouldn't show him as much deference. I must admit that on certain occasions, especially at his own house and on Sunday evenings when he has nothing to do, Darcy can be a rather intimidating figure." Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she detected a hint of offence and restrained her laughter. Miss Bingley strongly resented the perceived insult to her brother and expressed her displeasure in a conversation with him. "I see what you're doing, Bingley," his friend remarked. "You dislike arguments and want to put an end to this." "Perhaps I do. Arguments often turn into disputes. If you and Miss Bennet would kindly postpone yours until I leave the room, I would be very grateful. Then you can say whatever you like about me." Elizabeth replied, "What you ask is no inconvenience on my part, and Mr. Darcy would do well to finish his letter." Following Elizabeth's advice, Mr. Darcy completed his letter. When he had finished, he turned to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth and asked for some music. Miss Bingley promptly moved to the pianoforte, and after politely suggesting that Elizabeth should lead the way, an offer which Elizabeth politely but firmly declined, she began to play. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were engaged in their music, Elizabeth, who was flipping through some music books on the instrument, noticed how often Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She could hardly fathom why such a distinguished man would take an interest in her. However, the idea that he might be looking at her because he disliked her was even more puzzling. Eventually, she concluded that he noticed her because there was something about her that he found more objectionable and reprehensible, according to his standards, than in anyone else present. This thought did not bother her. She had little regard for his approval. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley changed the mood by playing a lively Scotch air. Soon after, Mr. Darcy approached Elizabeth and said, "Miss Bennet, don't you have a strong desire to dance a reel?" Elizabeth smiled, but didn't answer. He repeated the question, surprised by her silence. Elizabeth finally responded, "Oh, I heard you before, but I couldn't decide what to say in response. I know you wanted me to say yes so you could enjoy looking down on my taste. But I take delight in thwarting such schemes and preventing people from having their planned contempt. So, I've made up my mind to tell you that I have no desire to dance a reel at all. Now, go ahead and despise me if you dare." Darcy replied, "I do not dare." Elizabeth had expected to offend him but was astonished by his gallant response. There was a mixture of sweetness and playfulness in her manner that made it difficult for her to offend anyone. Darcy had never been so captivated by any woman before, and he genuinely believed that if it weren't for her lower social standing, he might be in some danger. Miss Bingley, sensing or suspecting Darcy's growing interest in Elizabeth, felt jealous. Her desire to get rid of Elizabeth was further fueled by her strong desire for Jane's recovery. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking Elizabeth by discussing their supposed marriage and planning the happiness that would come from such an alliance. The next day, as they walked together in the garden, Miss Bingley said, "I hope that when this desirable event takes place, you will give your mother-in-law some advice on the benefits of holding her tongue. And if possible, try to dissuade the younger girls from pursuing the officers. Also, if I may mention such a delicate matter, try to curb that slight hint of conceit and impertinence that your lady possesses. Do you have anything else to suggest for my domestic happiness?" Darcy inquired. "Oh, yes. Please have the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great-uncle, the judge. They are in the same profession, you know, just in different branches. As for a portrait of your Elizabeth, you mustn't attempt to have it painted. What painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes? It wouldn't be easy to capture their expression, but their color, shape, and remarkably fine eyelashes could be replicated." At that moment, they were interrupted by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself, who were coming from another path. "I didn't know you were going for a walk," Miss Bingley said, somewhat flustered, as she didn't want their conversation to be overheard. "You treated us quite unfairly," Mrs. Hurst added. "You left without informing us that you were going out." Taking Mr. Darcy's unoccupied arm, Mrs. Hurst left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path was narrow, and Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness. He immediately suggested, "This path is too narrow for our group. Let's move to the avenue." However, Elizabeth, who had no desire to stay with them, playfully responded, "No, no, stay where you are. You are beautifully arranged and look exceptionally charming. Adding a fourth person would spoil the picturesque scene. Goodbye." She then merrily ran off, hoping to be back home in a day or two. Jane had recovered enough to leave her room for a couple of hours that evening. Chapter 11. After dinner, when the ladies had retired, Elizabeth went to her sister Jane. She found Jane in good health, well guarded against the cold, and together they entered the drawing-room. They were warmly welcomed by their two friends, who expressed their pleasure at seeing them. Elizabeth had never seen Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst so agreeable as they were during the hour before the gentleman joined them. They were quite skilled in conversation, describing events accurately, sharing anecdotes with humour, and conversing with liveliness. However, when the gentleman entered the room, Jane was no longer the centre of attention. Miss Bingley's eyes immediately turned to Mr. Darcy, and she had something to say to him even before he had taken a few steps into the room. Mr. Darcy addressed Miss Bennet with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst made a slight bow and said he was very glad, but it was Mr. Bingley who showed the most warmth and enthusiasm in his greeting. He was full of joy and attention, spending the first half-hour piling up the fire to keep Jane warm in her new location in the room. He had requested her to move farther from the door for her comfort, and then he sat down next to her, hardly engaging with anyone else. Elizabeth, working in the opposite corner, observed it all with great delight. After tea, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law about playing cards, but she declined. She had received private information that Mr. Darcy did not wish to play cards, and Mr. Hurst's request was also denied. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the entire party on the matter seemed to support her statement. With no card game to play, Mr. Hurst had nothing to do but stretch out on one of the sofas and fall asleep. Mr. Darcy picked up a book, and Miss Bingley did the same. Mrs. Hurst, mostly occupied with playing with her bracelets and rings, occasionally joined her brother in conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was divided between watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book and reading her own book. She kept making inquiries or glancing at his page. However, she couldn't engage him in any conversation. He would briefly answer her questions and continue reading. Eventually, she became tired of her own book, which she had chosen only because it was the second volume of his. She let out a big yawn and remarked, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening like this. I declare, there's no enjoyment like reading. I get tired of everything else so much faster than of a book. When I have my own house, I'll be miserable if I don't have an excellent library." No one responded to her comment. She yawned again, put aside her book, and looked around the room for some form of amusement. Hearing her brother mention a ball to Miss Bennet, she suddenly turned towards him and said, "By the way, Charles, are you seriously considering a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you to consult the wishes of the present company before deciding. I would be surprised if there weren't some among us who would find a ball more of a punishment than a pleasure." Her brother responded, "If you mean Darcy, he can go to bed if he wishes before the ball begins. But as for the ball, it's already a settled matter. As soon as Nichols has prepared enough white soup, I'll send out my invitations." "I would like balls much better," she replied, "if they were conducted differently. The usual process of a ball is insufferably tedious. It would be more rational if conversation, rather than dancing, were the order of the day." "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I agree. But it wouldn't be much like a ball then," her brother commented. Miss Bingley did not respond and soon got up to walk around the room. She had an elegant figure and walked gracefully. However, her actions were primarily aimed at Mr. Darcy, who remained focused on his book. In her desperation, Miss Bingley decided to make one more effort. Turning to Elizabeth, she said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a stroll around the room. I assure you it's quite refreshing after sitting in one position for so long." Elizabeth was surprised but agreed immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded in her true intention. Mr. Darcy looked up. He was just as aware of the attention now directed at him as Elizabeth was. He unconsciously closed his book and was directly invited to join their group. However, he declined, explaining that he could see only two possible motives for their walk, and either would interfere with his joining them. This left Miss Bingley puzzled, and she asked Elizabeth if she could make sense of his words. Elizabeth replied, "Not at all, but I believe he intends to be critical of us. The best way to disappoint him is to not inquire further." Miss Bingley was persistent and insisted on an explanation of his two motives. Mr. Darcy then explained that they were either walking together because they shared confidential matters or because they thought they looked their best while walking. He suggested that if it were the former, he would be in their way, and if it were the latter, he could admire them better while sitting by the fire. Miss Bingley reacted with shock, exclaiming, "Oh, that's shocking! I've never heard anything so abominable. How should we punish him for such a statement?" Elizabeth responded, "It's quite easy, if you're willing. We can all tease and taunt one another. Tease him and make fun of him. Since you're so close, you must know how to do it." "But I honestly do not know how to do that," Miss Bingley confessed. "I assure you that my close relationship has not yet taught me that. Teasing someone with a calm temperament and composure is difficult. No, I believe he can withstand our efforts in that area. As for laughter, we should avoid making fools of ourselves by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy can congratulate himself." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," exclaimed Elizabeth. "That is indeed a rare advantage, and I hope it remains so. It would be a great loss for me to have too many acquaintances like him. I truly appreciate a good laugh." Miss Bingley responded, "Mr. Darcy has given me credit for more than I deserve. The wisest and best of men, and even their most virtuous actions, can be made ridiculous by someone who only seeks amusement in life." "Of course," Elizabeth replied, "there are such people. However, I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise or good. Foolishness, nonsense, quirks, and inconsistencies amuse me, I admit, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But those are precisely the things you seem to lack. Perhaps it's not possible for anyone. But I've spent my life trying to avoid those weaknesses that often expose a strong intellect to ridicule, such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a true weakness. But pride, when there is genuine intellectual superiority, can always be kept in check." Elizabeth turned away to conceal a smile. Miss Bingley, eager to change the topic of conversation, said, "Let's have some music." She was tired of the current discussion in which she had no part. "Louisa, you won't mind if I wake Mr. Hurst?" Her sister had no objections, and the pianoforte was opened. After a brief moment of thought, Mr. Darcy was not sorry for this turn of events. He had begun to realize the danger of paying too much attention to Elizabeth. Chapter 12. Elizabeth and Jane decide to leave Netherfield and return home. Elizabeth writes a letter to her mother, requesting that the carriage be sent for them. Mrs. Bennet had expected her daughters to stay at Netherfield until the following Tuesday, which would complete Jane's week-long visit. However, she is not pleased with the idea of their leaving earlier, and her response is not favourable. Mrs. Bennet informs them that the carriage cannot be sent until Tuesday and suggests that if Mr. Bingley and his sister insist, they can stay longer. Elizabeth is eager to leave and tries to persuade Jane to ask Mr. Bingley for his carriage immediately. Eventually, it is decided that they will inform Mr. Bingley and his sister about their plan to leave that morning and make the request. When they communicate their intention to leave, Miss Bingley expresses concern and wishes that they would stay at least one more day. Jane agrees to delay their departure until the following day, and so they remain for the time being. Miss Bingley regrets her suggestion of the delay as her jealousy and dislike for Jane outweigh her affection for Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, is relieved to hear that Elizabeth will be leaving soon. He has been trying to keep his distance from her as her presence has begun to affect him more than he would like. Meanwhile, Miss Bingley continues to be unkind to Elizabeth and more teasing than usual towards Mr. Darcy. On Sunday, after morning service, the Bennet sisters depart from Netherfield. Miss Bingley's civility towards Elizabeth increases rapidly, as does her affection for Jane. They part ways with warm wishes, and Elizabeth leaves the gathering in high spirits. Upon their return home, their mother, Mrs. Bennet, is not very welcoming. She wonders why they have returned and believes they were wrong to cause trouble. She also fears that Jane may have caught a cold again. However, their father is pleased to see them, even though he expresses his pleasure in a reserved manner. The absence of Jane and Elizabeth has a noticeable impact on the evening conversation, which lacks its usual liveliness and sense. The other Bennet sisters, Mary, Catherine, Kitty, and Lydia, have their own news to share. Mary is engrossed in her study of music and morality, while Catherine and Lydia have information to share about the events in the regiment since the previous Wednesday, including officers dining with their uncle and rumours of Colonel Forster's impending marriage. Chapter 13. Darling, Mr. Bennet said to his wife during breakfast the next morning, I hope you've ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family gathering. Who do you mean, dear? I don't know of anyone coming, unless Charlotte Lucas happens to drop by. I hope our dinners are satisfactory for her. I don't think she often has such meals at home. The person I'm talking about is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes lit up. A gentleman and a stranger. It must be Mr. Bingley, I'm sure. Jane, you never mentioned this. You sly thing. Well, I'll be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But, dear me, how unlucky. We don't have any fish today. Lydia, my dear, ring the bell. I must talk to Hill this instant. It's not Mr. Bingley, her husband replied. It's someone I've never met in my entire life. This statement caused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being bombarded with questions from his wife and 5 daughters all at once. After entertaining their curiosity for a while, he explained further. About a month ago, I received this letter, and about 2 weeks ago, I responded to it. I thought it was a delicate matter that required prompt attention. It's from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, once I am gone, can evict all of you from this house whenever he pleases." "Oh, my dear," his wife exclaimed, "I can't stand hearing about that odious man. Please don't talk about him. I think it's the most unfair thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. If I were you, I would have tried to do something about it a long time ago." Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain the concept of an entail to her. They had tried to do so before, but Mrs. Bennet was beyond reason on the matter. She continued to bitterly complain about the injustice of settling the estate away from her 5 daughters in favor of a man nobody cared about. "It's certainly a highly unjust situation," Mr. Bennet acknowledged. "Mr. Collins can't be absolved of the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you read his letter, you might be somewhat softened by his way of expressing himself." "No, I'm sure I won't be," she retorted. "I think it was very impertinent of him to write to you at all, and very hypocritical. I detest such false friends. Why couldn't he continue quarreling with you, just like his father did before him?" "Well, it seems he had some reservations regarding that," Mr. Bennet replied, "as you'll see. Hunsford, near Westerham, Kent, the 15th of October. Dear Sir, the ongoing disagreement between you and my late esteemed father always troubled me. After his passing, I frequently wished to reconcile the rift, but for a time, my own doubts held me back. I was afraid it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with someone he had always been at odds with. There you have it, Mrs. Bennet. But now my mind is made up on the matter," he continued. "Since I received ordination at Easter, I've had the good fortune to gain the favour of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh. Her generosity and kindness have secured for me the valuable rectory of this parish. I am committed to treating her ladyship with grateful respect and to faithfully perform the rites and ceremonies of the Church of England. As a clergyman, I also feel obligated to promote peace in all families within my influence. On these grounds, I believe that my current offer of goodwill is commendable. I hope that the fact I'm next in line to inherit the Longbourn estate will be viewed favorably on your side, and that it won't lead you to reject my offer of reconciliation. I am truly sorry for any harm I may have caused your amiable daughters and assure you of my willingness to make amends. But we can discuss that later. If you don't object, I propose to visit you and your family on Monday, November 18th, at 4 o'clock. I may stay until the following Saturday fortnight without inconvenience, as Lady Catherine does not object to my occasional absence on Sundays, provided another clergyman is available to conduct the service. Yours faithfully and with respectful regards to your lady and daughters, William Collins. So, at 4 o'clock, we can expect this peacemaking gentleman, Mr. Bennet remarked as he folded up the letter. He appears to be a conscientious and polite young man, in my opinion, and I believe he will prove to be a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine permits him to visit us again. There is some wisdom in what he says about the girls, Jane noted. And if he is willing to make amends, I won't discourage him. It's hard to guess how he plans to make up for what he thinks is owed to us, Elizabeth added, but his intention is certainly commendable. Elizabeth was particularly struck by Mr. Collins's extraordinary respect for Lady Catherine and his willingness to perform various church ceremonies for his parishioners. He's quite an odd character, I think, she said. I can't quite figure him out. There's something very pompous about his style. And what does he mean by apologizing for being next in line for the estate? It's not as if he could have prevented it even if he wanted to. Do you think he's a sensible man, father? No, my dear, I don't think so, Mr. Bennet replied. I have high hopes that he'll prove to be quite the opposite. There's a mix of servility and self-importance in his letter that bodes well. I'm eager to meet him. In terms of composition, Mary remarked, his letter doesn't seem to have any notable flaws. The idea of offering an olive branch, while not entirely original, is expressed quite well. Catherine and Lydia, on the other hand, found neither the letter nor its author to be particularly interesting. It was nearly impossible for them to imagine their cousin arriving in anything other than a red coat, and it had been several weeks since they had enjoyed the company of a man dressed in any other color. As for their mother, Mr. Collins's letter had somewhat softened her ill will, and she was preparing to meet him with a surprising degree of composure, much to the astonishment of her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins arrived promptly, and the entire family received him with great politeness. Mr. Bennet said little, but the ladies were more than willing to engage in conversation, and Mr. Collins didn't require any encouragement to talk. He was a tall, rather serious-looking young man of 25. His demeanor was formal and dignified. He hadn't been seated for long before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having such a fine family of daughters. He mentioned that he had heard much about their beauty but felt that fame had not done justice to the truth. He added that he had no doubt that she would see all her daughters well married in due course. This gallant speech didn't sit well with some of the listeners, but Mrs. Bennet, who never turned down a compliment, responded promptly. "You're very kind, sir, I'm sure," she said. "I hope with all my heart that it turns out that way, or else they'll be quite destitute. Things are rather peculiar, you see." "You're referring, perhaps, to the entailment of the estate?" Mr. Collins inquired. "Yes, sir, indeed I am," Mrs. Bennet replied. "It's a grievous matter for my poor girls, you must admit. I don't mean to blame you, I know that such things are left to chance in this world. One can never predict how estates will be passed down once they're entailed. I understand the hardship it poses to my dear cousins," Mr. Collins acknowledged. "I could say much more on the subject, but I'm wary of coming across as presumptuous and hasty. However, I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them. For now, I won't say more, but perhaps as we get to know each other better." His sentence was cut short by a summons to dinner, and the girls exchanged smiles. They weren't the only ones receiving compliments from Mr. Collins. The hall, dining room, and all the furniture within were examined and praised. His praise for everything would have warmed Mrs. Bennet's heart if it weren't for the disheartening notion that he viewed it all as his future property. The dinner itself was also highly admired, and he inquired which of his lovely cousins was responsible for its excellent preparation. Mrs. Bennet corrected him with a touch of asperity, informing him that they were perfectly capable of keeping a good cook and that her daughters had no responsibilities in the kitchen. He apologized for any offense he may have caused and continued to express his regret for about a quarter of an hour. Chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet hardly said a word. But once the servants left, he decided it was time to engage his guest in conversation. He chose a topic he expected Mr. Collins to excel in by remarking how fortunate he seemed to be with his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his needs and comfort had been truly remarkable. Mr. Bennet couldn't have picked a better subject. Mr. Collins sang Lady Catherine's praises enthusiastically. The topic filled him with an unusual solemnity, and he declared that he had never seen such behavior in a person of her rank, such affability and condescension. Mr. Collins mentioned that Lady Catherine had even approved of both his previous sermons, invited him twice to dine at Rosings, and recently summoned him to join her for quadrille on Saturday. While many considered Lady Catherine proud, Mr. Collins had only witnessed her affability. She treated him no differently from any other gentleman, allowed him to socialize with the locals, and even endorsed his occasional visits to his family. She had even advised him to marry when he deemed it appropriate. Lady Catherine had once visited his humble parsonage and fully endorsed the improvements he had made, even suggesting some additions herself, such as shelves in the upstairs closets. "That all sounds very proper and polite, I'm sure," Mrs. Bennet commented, "and I imagine she's a very agreeable woman. It's a shame that most highborn ladies aren't more like her. Does she live nearby, sir?" "My humble dwelling is separated from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence, by only a lane," Mr. Collins replied. "Did you mention that she's a widow, sir? Does she have any children?" "She has one daughter, the heiress of Rosings and its extensive property." Mrs. Bennet shook her head and remarked, "Well, then she's better off than many young ladies." "And what is this young lady like? Is she beautiful?" "She is an exceedingly charming young lady," Mr. Collins answered. "Lady Catherine herself has declared that Miss de Bourgh surpasses the handsomest women in true beauty, owing to the distinguished air about her features that marks her as a woman of noble birth. Unfortunately, she has a frail constitution, which has hindered her from achieving the accomplishments she otherwise would have excelled in. This information comes from the lady who oversaw her education and still resides with them. Nevertheless, she is entirely amiable and often condescends to pass by my humble dwelling in her little phaeton with her ponies." "Has she made her debut in society?" "I don't recall her name among the ladies at court. Her delicate health unfortunately prevents her from being in town," Mr. Collins explained. "As I mentioned to Lady Catherine herself one day, her absence has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased by the idea, and you can understand that I'm always eager to offer these little compliments, which are always appreciated by ladies. I've told Lady Catherine more than once that her delightful daughter seems destined to be a duchess. The most elevated rank would be adorned by her, rather than the other way around. These are the sorts of attentions that please her ladyship, and I feel particularly obliged to provide them." "You're quite correct," Mr. Bennet agreed. "It's fortunate that you possess the talent for delicate flattery. May I inquire whether these pleasing attentions are spontaneous or the result of prior planning?" "They are mostly a response to the moment," Mr. Collins explained. "Although I sometimes amuse myself by suggesting and arranging such elegant compliments as might suit ordinary situations, I always aim to make them appear as uncontrived as possible." Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully met. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped. He listened with great amusement, maintaining an unwavering composure and only occasionally casting a glance at Elizabeth, showing no need for a companion in his enjoyment. By tea time, Mr. Collins had become insufferable, and Mr. Bennet was relieved to return to the drawing-room. After tea, he invited Mr. Collins to read to the ladies, to which he agreed. A book was brought out, but upon seeing it, as it clearly came from a circulating library, Mr. Collins recoiled and, apologizing, declared that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were brought out, and after some deliberation, Mr. Collins chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia yawned as he opened the book, and before he had read 3 pages with monotonous solemnity, she interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that Uncle Phillips is considering firing Richard? If he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me this herself on Saturday. I intend to walk to Meryton tomorrow to find out more and inquire about Mr. Denny's return from town." Lydia's older sisters instructed her to be silent, but Mr. Collins, deeply offended, set aside his book and stated, "I have often noticed that young ladies have little interest in serious books written specifically for their education. It astonishes me, I confess, as instruction can be highly beneficial to them. But I shall no longer trouble my young cousin." He then turned to Mr. Bennet and proposed a game of backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, noting that Mr. Collins was wise to leave the girls to their own amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized politely for Lydia's interruption and promised it would not happen again if Mr. Collins would continue reading his book. However, he, somewhat offended, put the book aside and stated, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested in books of a serious nature, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin." He then turned to Mr. Bennet and offered himself as his opponent in a game of backgammon.